Alrighty then, today I'm going to be talking about the best non-fiction books that I read in 2021. I don't talk about non-fiction books that much on the channel, but I did mention them briefly in my last 50 books in my room video, and I thought it'd be nice and just something a little bit different to talk about some non-fiction books that I read this year and that I think are worth checking out. So without further ado, here are 6 great non-fiction books. So first up we have The Republic by Plato. This is a classic philosophical text coming from ancient Greece, in which Plato, through the character of Socrates, tries to explore the question, what is justice? Both trying to understand justice in the soul, so in a human being, and also trying to understand justice in a city. This leads Plato to construct his idea of what the ideal state would be like, and it's a very fascinating ideal state because on the one hand it has some progressive ideas, things like gender equality are mentioned, but on the other hand it comes across as vaguely totalitarian. So it's a very interesting idea for a just state, and it's just a very interesting book altogether. Now I've actually read bits of this for years because I am a philosophy student, or I was a philosophy student, but I never actually read the whole thing until this year when I was teaching a course on it, so I thought I'd better read the whole thing. And I was blown away by how amazing this text is. Usually when you're learning these things as part of a course, you only really focus on the philosophical arguments in the text, and it wasn't really easy to see what the kind of literary merit, if you like, of the text would be. And it's a shame because I think seeing the text in its whole, as a whole thing, I was able to appreciate it just so much more. Plato doesn't just use classical logical argument, he also uses narrative techniques by creating this dialogue between Socrates and other characters and creating an overall framing narrative. In fact, the last part of the Republic speculates on what heaven would be like or the afterlife would be like, and you just have this really beautiful scene and these vivid descriptions of that world. And while it's kind of bordering on fantasy at that point and not really philosophy, it's just a fantastic and interesting way to end a philosophical work, especially because academic philosophy as it's done now in the West tends to be quite dry and certainly doesn't rely on that many literary techniques. So it was interesting to see just a very different way of doing philosophy. I was also able to appreciate the arguments in this book a lot more by reading the whole thing. It was a sort of text where when you start reading it and when you read fragments of it, it just seems like Plato keeps going off on these digressions to ignore questions that get put to his character. But actually, when you get to the end of the book, everything just kind of fits together and slots into place perfectly. Kind of like the best Dickens novels, where you have all of these mysteries and little twists and turns getting set up and you find it hard to keep track of everything, and then as the novel kind of comes to an end, everything just fits perfectly into place. And that's what The Republic felt like to me. If you want an example of just a really interesting philosophical work, I'd definitely give this book a go. It's not particularly difficult to read, and like I say, it relies just as much on literary techniques as it does on philosophical argument, which is also ironic given that Plato wasn't very sympathetic towards artists and especially poets, but that's all by the by. Very interesting book with lots of interesting things to say, definitely worth a read. Next up we have The Philosophers of India by Heinrich Zimmer. Another book that focuses on ancient philosophy, but this time we're focusing on India and the various schools of philosophical thought that have evolved over time in India. But mainly it does focus on kind of ancient Indian philosophy and as that developed over time. This book covers many of the classic texts of Indian philosophy and also various different traditions such as Jainism and Buddhism and many others. It also looks at the political structures of India and how that has influenced and shaped its philosophies over time as well. I just found this to be a very interesting book for someone who hasn't really read all that much in the Indian philosophical tradition, and it was a really engaging overview of those schools, which surprised me because it's quite an old text, and so I was expecting it to be quite stuffy and verbose, and in some ways it was, but it was always done in such a way that I really found it engaging. It wasn't dry or boring, it was just a really engaging text, albeit a little bit dated. If you want a systematic introduction to Indian philosophy, I would definitely give this book a go. Not only is it engaging and interesting, but it seems to give a pretty comprehensive view of Indian philosophy, and it certainly helped me understand that tradition a lot more. It's definitely a book that I'm going to be rereading though, because there's just so much going on in this book that to come to grips with it, you really need to read it a few times. Nevertheless, fantastic book, and as someone who's just starting out and getting interested in Indian philosophy, this wasn't a bad place to start. Next up, we're moving away from philosophy and into literary criticism with Camille Parlia's Break, Blow, Burn. Now, Break, Blow, Burn is a book that has encouraged me even more to get interested in poetry. In this book, Parlia analyses 43 of the world's greatest poems, going all the way from Shakespeare right up to the present day, more or less, with Joni Mitchell. Each chapter of the book has one poem, and then it follows a short essay by Palia where she does a close reading of the poem. Now, as someone who, for basically his whole life, did not get poetry at all and was not into poetry at all, this book did a fantastic job of convincing me to get into poetry and to understand it and appreciate it. Palia opens the book by saying that this book is targeted at a general audience. Her aim here is to inspire people to appreciate poetry and understand it, and in my view she does a fantastic job. I like how she just takes us through the poem as if she's taking you through a gallery, a museum. She starts at the beginning and she shows you line by line how the poem is progressing and how the stanzas all relate to each other and how it develops. And it's just a fantastic and engaging way to talk about these poems. What I also like is Palia's writing style. She just has such a distinctive style of writing where I always hear her voice in my head whenever I'm reading something by her. And the best thing of all is that she just loves these poems, and it really comes through in the writing. There's no kind of sneering or looking down or superiority complex in Palia's work. She just really enjoys poetry and wants to talk about it like a fan, basically. And that's the kind of art criticism that I really enjoy. It's positive criticism by people who love the artwork that they're discussing. And if that's the kind of art criticism that you want, then you definitely should give this book a go. And also, if you're like me, someone who didn't really get poetry before, this might be the book that makes you like it, because it certainly helped me enjoy poetry. And now we're back to philosophy again, surprise, surprise, although a slightly different kind of philosophy again. This time it's Being in Time by Martin Heidegger. It's a really hard book to summarize very quickly, and I wouldn't say that I'm competent enough to really, give you the essence of the book, but essentially it seems like Heidegger is asking the question, what does it mean to be? As in, what does it mean to exist? And he does this by trying to think about what it means for us as individual humans to exist in the world. Now, if that sounds abstract and vague, it's because this book is quite abstract and vague. It's a very difficult book to follow, with lots of terminology that is hard to really remember what he's talking about, and that kind of makes it an interesting book, just the fact that it's like this huge puzzle that you have to unravel. It's the exact opposite, say, of The Republic by Plato, which is told in a much more direct style, and it's generally quite obvious what Plato is talking about because he tries his best to make his arguments quite clear, whereas Heidegger is a lot more vague and detached and strange by comparison. That's not to say that this is a bad book by any stretch, it's just to say that it's a very different tradition of philosophy. And this is a philosophical tradition called continental philosophy, which I'm not really familiar with myself, and this was my first kind of big step into that tradition. I'm not sure that it's my favourite way of doing philosophy in the world, because I do find it to be maybe overly complex when it doesn't necessarily need to be. Seems like things could be put in a much more clearer way. Nevertheless, I did find it to be a very interesting text, and even if I didn't enjoy reading it, I enjoyed the pain of reading it, so it's still a good text and worth reading. Next up we have a book that combines basically everything, a bit of philosophy, a bit of psychology, a bit of politics, and also a book that basically began the question of gender, and that is Simone de Beauvoir's The Second Sex. This book is essentially a huge exploration of the concept of woman, and it goes from looking at woman in the biological sense, in the social sense, also looking at how woman is represented in archetypes, in literature, and then also thinking about what woman can be in the future. It's a huge book with a massive scope, and in my view it hasn't really been done better since this book. It pretty much is just the bedrock for thinking about gender, and in particular the idea of what a woman is. And while some of its ideas, don't necessarily agree with all of them, it's still just very interesting to see someone take on this topic and present such a systematic and huge account of this topic. And what's interesting the most about The Second Sex is that it seems to influence people from very different schools of feminist thought, sometimes for better, sometimes for worse. I really enjoyed the parts of the book where de Beauvoir looks at the various female archetypes and tries to understand them and what they mean or represent when it comes to women. And I also quite like the bits where she talks about art and literature, although I do think there are some cases where I disagree with her, especially her interpretation of Emily Bronte in Wuthering Heights. Didn't agree with that at all. Nevertheless, I still found what she had to say very interesting, and she writes in a very engaging style as well. And last on the list we have Civilization and Its Discontents by Sigmund Freud. This is a book where Freud explores the conflicts between the individual need of human beings to express themselves and the need for society to constrain the actions of individuals wanting to express themselves. In it, Freud seems to argue that there are certain immutable forces in human nature, impulses towards aggression, violence, and sex, which need to be expressed in a healthy way, and he looks at the ways in which society, in particular the religious norms in society at the time, repress those and essentially damage people psychologically. In this work, and in the essay that, at least in my version, is attached to it, Freud argues for the need for men and women to express their sexuality, which was very interesting to me because usually all the stuff I hear about Freud, usually from people who haven't really read much of Freud, is that he is generally, anti-woman. But in this book, he actually seems to present an argument that it's actually a good thing for men and women not to be bounded by overly repressive sexual moralities coming usually, or at least in his time period anyway, from religion. So what I liked about this book is that it presented a more nuanced picture of Freud that I suspected but didn't know for sure was there. What I also like about the book though is just Freud's writing style. Again, like with say Plato, you have this way of doing an academic discipline that isn't just completely dry and dull, but actually employs literary devices and techniques. Freud is a writer who was definitely influenced by great literature, and that comes across in his writing style. So even when I don't even agree with half of what he's saying, I still enjoy reading his work because he just writes in such an interesting way. And that to me is, what I'm all about. I love writers who write well. Even if it's in an academic discipline, I still think it's really good if you can actually string a sentence together in a way that engages your reader rather than putting them to sleep. And I would say that that's pretty much true of all the writers on this list. Whether it's de Beauvoir, whether it's Freud, Plato, Heidegger, even though they don't necessarily agree with what they're saying, I just think that they write in a very wonderful and beautiful way, which makes what they're writing all the more worth engaging with. Okay, that's it for this list of great non-fiction books. If you've read any non-fiction this year, what did you read? Did you enjoy it? If you've read any of the books that I've talked about today, what do you think of those books? Happy to have those discussions with you down in the comments. But that is it for this video. Take care everyone, and a happy new year.